Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. In this podcast, I wanted to offer a critique of the New Age movement. Now, I realize that the New Age movement is a very complex and detailed movement. It is not just one thing. It has many moving parts to it. So I will admittedly be simplifying it in this podcast, and I apologize for that, for anybody who is a devotee of one or more branches of that particular movement, for leaving things out, for maybe collapsing certain things into a single category that may or may not be appropriate. And so if I have unintentionally offended anybody, I am sorry. But now on to the podcast. Um, when I left the New Left, no pun intended, the New Left died. And that was basically the end of the New Left, pretty much. I was in the New Left from 1968 to 1969. Um, the group I was a part of was the Students' Democratic Coalition, which was, at least in principle, connected with the Democratic Party. Why? Well, because at that time, many of us, many people who were of my generation, so-called baby boomers, thought that the Democratic Party would be the route to achieving communism or socialism. I know I did. That was my objective. We were wrong. The Democratic Party is not even, I would say, left of center, or if it is only barely left of center. The base of the New Left is moderate. Why? Well, what is the base of the Democratic Party? At least in 2023, and I don't think it was that much different in 1968 and 1979. The base is basically African Americans. And African Americans tend to be moderates. Does that mean that all African Americans are moderates? No, of course not. You can't say all about anything. But for the most part, African Americans are moderates. And that is why we have basically never seen a leftist become president of the United States, at least in my lifetime. Anybody that I would call a leftist, a communist, or even a democratic socialist, who, in my opinion, would not even really be a leftist, but you at least somebody could argue that maybe it was a step in that direction. We have never even seen a democratic socialist become president of the United States. So we had hope, however, back in the New Left, that that might happen. We were opposed to the Vietnam War. We were opposed to nuclear ballistic missiles, and we were opposed to the oppression of migrant workers by California grape farm owners. And we were therefore in solidarity with Cesar Chavez. But we failed. We failed miserably. And I have talked about that in a previous podcast, so there's really no need to go over old territory once again. My point in mentioning this is not to talk about the New Left per se, but it's to talk about what happened as a result of our failure. Because of the failure of the New Left to produce anything meaningful. By meaningful, I mean leftist. That's what I mean by meaningful. And because of the failure of the leaders of the New Left to give us any direction on what we should do, again, we fell apart. I remember coming back to school in 8th grade, looking for the people I had worked with. and they were not there anymore. I couldn't find them. I literally never saw most of those people ever again. Why? Well, it was a big school. My junior high school, which today would be called a middle school, was pretty large. And so it was easy to get lost. I simply never saw them again. I mean, a middle school is not like a college or university where you can simply roam around from one place to another. You basically have to have had a hall pass, and you were pretty much stuck in whatever class you were in. So I just never saw those people again. The meetings stopped. We used to have meetings after class. They were extracurricular activities that we were engaged in. And then in eighth grade, those meetings simply ended. I was, for all intents and purposes, the vice president of our chapter. The person who was the president, and I will only use her first name here, her name was Steffi. She was a wonderful girl, but she disappeared. Oh, or I disappeared. Maybe I disappeared to her. I have no idea. I guess we could both argue over who disappeared. But I tried to find her, and I was unsuccessful. We had failed. We really, really failed. In the 1970s, there was the new communist movement, which tried to pick up some of the slack that was left behind by people like me. And they did some good, but they also basically failed. And so at the same time as the new communist movement was active, another movement was also active, which was destined, well, maybe destined is the wrong word, which was about to become the major social movement of that time. And what I am referring to is the New Age movement. Now, what is New Ageism? That's where you get into complexities. You can trace New Ageism, if you want to go back far enough, to Emanuel Swedenborg. I would prefer not to go quite that far back, maybe to trace it back to H.P. Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, maybe to trace it back to Rudolf Steiner, the founder of Anthroposophy, but I think especially, perhaps the most important figure in New Ageism was Alice Bailey. People in the New Age movement seemed to be obsessed with what were commonly called back then, and may, for all I know, still be called, the Bailey books. Now, Alice Bailey was originally an adherent of Blavatsky's Theosophy. She had some differences with Theosophy, which by that time had factionalized into about 4 different sects. And so her organization did not even have the name Theosophy in it. It was called the Arcane School. And she also had some other organizations which were connected to the Arcane School. But the Arcane School was the major organization. It was basically a mail order organization where you would pay money and get lessons in the mail. I never did. I had no interest whatsoever in the Arcane School. Or some people never did that. They just got the Bailey books. The Alice Bailey books were in many ways a continuation, or perhaps you can say an elaboration of the ideas of H.P. Blavatsky. So, for example, the concept of ascended masters, which later became a major theme of the New Age movement. In a sense, you can trace that back to Blavatsky herself, but she never used the term ascended masters. She talked about the masters in the Himalayan mountains. Alice Bailey did use that term. And she wrote about them. And she claimed that these beings made up some kind of a supernatural hierarchy that was in charge of the planet Earth, and that by turning to them, we could be inspired. Bailey claimed that she was able to, using modern parlance, channel some of these ascended masters and reveal to the rest of us what these masters were teaching. So the entire notion of channeling really owes its origins to Alice Bailey. The I Am movement was one of the first channeling movements, but there have been a lot of others since the I Am movement. And there were some legal problems that the I Am movement ran into as well. There was a court case, which I think was kind of frivolous, to be honest. Not to say I have any sympathy with I Am, but I still think the court case was frivolous. They claimed that the founders of I Am knew that what they were teaching were lies, but they were promoting them nonetheless. Well, how in the world can you get inside somebody's head and know that they are lying? Obviously, that's not possible. And yet that's precisely what the case was against the I Am movement, that the founders were lying, that they simply made it up. Now, do I agree that they made it up? Yes, of course. But bringing a court case against them based upon that, I don't understand it, and I've never really understood it. But all of the different people who claim to be channels today, and that has become one of the hearts of the New Age movement, basically claim to be channeling some entity or entities from another world, another universe, or perhaps even another galaxy. So I personally have had acquaintance with several people who were involved with various channeling movements, including a relative who I will not name, who was involved in this one movement called the Teachings of Abraham. One thing I have noticed about these channels or channelers, I don't know, channelers, not sure which, is that when they are channeling, they all seem to revert to speaking in a kind of quasi-British accent. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. I mean, I have my ideas, but they're only speculations. What I think is happening is that these channels or channelers want to sound differently from the way that they ordinarily sound. It is pretty easy for Americans to impersonate an English accent. Pretty easy. And so it makes sense, I guess, that these individuals would put on a British accent, more specifically an English accent. I don't know what type of English accent, maybe different types, when they were engaged in the practice of channeling. The intriguing part of New Ageism is that no matter who the channel was, no matter what the source of the channeling was, whether it was extra-dimensional, interplanetary, extra-glacial, I have no idea. They all seemed to present the same basic ideas. Same basic ideas. Those ideas were pretty much drawn from New Thought. New Thought, meaning you think good, you think well, you think positively, and good things will happen to you. Also, many of these channels would draw upon the work of Alice Bailey. Understandably, she was one of the heroines of the New Age movement. And so you see a lot of replication. I suppose you could call it plagiarism, although might be a stretch because it wasn't exactly that they were quoting Bailey word for word, but certainly they got their ideas pretty much from Alice Bailey. And they were essentially repeating what Alice Bailey had taught. So there's a kind of uniformity to what these channels were saying. There really wasn't that much of a difference. You could listen to one channel, you'd listen to another channel, could listen to another channel, and they were all essentially saying the same things. There wasn't much of a difference. It really didn't matter, to the best of my knowledge, which channel you listened to. You still got the same basic information, and that information was generally conveyed by Americans speaking with a quasi-English accent, which for some reason has always struck me as humorous. I don't know why, but it always has. Other New Agers became interested in other kinds of things. Crystals was one important thing. A lot of people who were New Agers loved crystals, and they claimed all these supernatural powers that these crystals supposedly had. And that if you use the crystal in the right way, that you could be healed of disease, whether mental, emotional, or physical. Some New Agers got interested in a lot of herbal medicine. Some got interested in homeopathy, which is a fallacious method of medicine. It's been studied, and it literally does not work. Some got interested in flower remedies, and there are two basic species of those. One were Bach flower remedies, which were the original kind, and the other were called California flower remedies. They were just basically, I guess, extracts of flowers that you would take in some form. I think usually they were mixed with alcohol, although I might be wrong about that. That's pretty much the way that homeopathic remedies were also administered. Generally, they were placed under the tongue. Now, is there any evidence that these flower remedies actually work? Of course not. Of course not. There is absolutely no evidence that they work. The US government carried out an extensive study on a wide variety of New Age healing techniques. For example, Reiki. Reiki was very popular. I studied Reiki. I became a Reiki master. I did. Reiki is basically kind of a laying on of hands healing method, except you don't actually put your hands on the body. You put it maybe like a quarter of an inch away. My guess, although I'm not sure, is that the reason for that is to protect themselves from any kind of legal liability. In other words, if they touched the individual, they could be accused of practicing medicine or practicing massage, for example. In order to touch a patient, you had to be a licensed massage therapist. And most Reiki healers were not licensed, and so they did not actually touch the person. Very similar to Reiki were therapeutic touch, which was started by nurses, and Jo-Rei, which came out of Japan. They were all very similar techniques which assumed that you could transfer energy through your hands and into the body of the other person. Again, all of these things that I have mentioned were studied, all of them and more, and none of them were shown to be effective. And yet, perhaps no one should be surprised. A lot of people still practice these techniques. A lot of people. And some of the techniques are really, really weird, like Wilhelm Reich's orgonomy. Now, you could argue that orgonomy is not directly connected with New Ageism, and maybe that's true, but it certainly parallels it. Wilhelm Reich was originally from Germany, and he died in prison. Now, why did Wilhelm Reich die in prison? Because he was making these things called orgone accumulators, which supposedly stored up the energy produced by the human orgasm. So what he would do is he would get supposedly sexually healthy people to have intercourse inside of an orgone accumulator, and then he would put people who had, I guess, sexual dysfunctions in those accumulators, and allegedly they would absorb that orgone energy from the accumulator and would become sexually healthy. Now, Reich argued that orgone was actually the energy of the universe. So that's a pretty spectacular claim. Is there any evidence for that? Of course not. Now, what happened to Reich? The Food and Drug Administration in the US ordered Wilhelm Reich to stop selling the orgone accumulators. I guess he could have sold them if he didn't make these fantastic medical promises, but he did. I mean, if he wanted to sell them as trinkets, I doubt anybody would have cared, but he wasn't selling them as trinkets. He was selling them as kinds of medical apparatus. And people were buying them, some people. And the FDA said, stop it. So the FDA was actually playing softball with him. They didn't come down hard on him and simply send out agents and arrest him. They said, look, you cannot sell these things. You are not a licensed medical professional. You are not qualified to sell these kinds of medical apparatus. Well, Wilhelm Reich ignored the FDA, and he kept on selling them. So wouldn't you know it, the FDA, understandably, came by and arrested him. Regrettably, and this was not the FDA's fault. I mean, the guy was pretty old. He died in prison. That's what happens when you get old, I guess. It'll happen, I guess, fairly soon to me, although hopefully not in prison. So you have all of these kinds of absurd kinds of treatments, often referred to as holistic health, which were bound up with the New Age movement. One of them, for example, was called Rolfing. Rolfing was inspired by Wilhelm Reich's orgonomy indirectly. I never actually had Rolfing done to me, nor would I, but I attended a whole health exhibition in New York City. This is back like in the early 1970s. I was still in high school. And literally these people were pounding. It was like this. It was like, I can't even, I don't want to do it that fast. I'm afraid I'll break something. But they were literally pounding on these people. And supposedly, by pounding on a person's body, you would actually heal them of some type of disease. Now, is there any evidence that Rolfing works? Again, of course not. So Okay. What has happened is that collectively, these quasi methods of healing have become known as alternative and complementary forms of medicine. Are they really forms of medicine? No, at least not for the most part. Maybe some are, maybe some have minimal effect, like herbs, for example. Maybe some herbs can actually help a person, perhaps. But for the most part, no. For the most part, they were just basically frauds. And yet people bought into it. And people still buy into it. Just like people buy into crystals, just like people buy into astrology, just like people buy into all the other things that I talked about so far in this podcast. So, what is my point? There is, believe it or not, a method to my madness. And that is that what the New Age movement effectively did was it filled a gap that was created by the end of the New Left. And the New Left has nobody but itself, and I include myself in that, to blame. I was a kid, so do you blame a 13-year-old kid? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But there were some people in the New Left who were college and university students and graduate students, and some older. Now, them I think you could justifiably blame. They basically failed. We failed. I'll include myself. We failed. We failed to produce communism that opened the floodgates to all this nonsense coming in, which referred to itself as the New Age and holistic health movements, which were really both a part of the same thing. So, in effect, materialism and realism, which is what Marxism is. I mean, Marxism is based on reality, is based on matter, is not based on idealism. In fact, Karl Marx was opposed to idealism, was opposed specifically to German idealism in the form specifically as it was developed by Hegel, but not exclusively Hegel. So people were looking for something. Well, we didn't provide it. We failed. So the New Age movement basically took our place. And so my critique of the New Age movement is really misleading. And I admit that. Really, what I'm doing is I'm critiquing the New Left. Because we failed, the New Age movement found a place to replace us. If we had succeeded, and I don't know how we could have, especially not in the United States. The United States is not a country ready for revolution. That's why I am now a Maoist-Third worldist, because I recognize that there's not going to be a revolution, at least not imminently, I believe, in the first world. In the third world, yeah, maybe eventually. I sure hope so. Because the New Age movement, which replaced the New Left, was a complete pile of hoaxes and never really accomplished anything for anyone. Well, I guess except making money for the people selling those ridiculous services. And there are a lot of people who made a lot of money especially those channels who charged enormous amounts of money for people to come to their channeling sessions and listen to them supposedly channel these whatever entities from who knows what where. So my critique, again, I guess you could say it's double-sided. It is both a critique of my movement, the movement that I grew up in, where I came of age in 1968 and 1969, the New Left. That's what made me into the person I am now. That's literally what prepared me to become a Maoist third worldist, because of my interest in the work of Cesar Chavez and the Mexican migrant workers. But it's also a critique of the New Age movement and the kind of foolishness of people that would fall for those kinds of ridiculous hoaxes, things that literally did nothing to help anyone except the people who were selling those hoaxes. For now, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.